I'm largely going to talk about the regulatory challenges in making cannabis or cannabinoids available for medical use. And I think it's just worth making the point that this whole debate is a byproduct of the debate about whether we should legalise recreational cannabis use. Because if recreational cannabis use were legal, there'd be no debate about medical uses of cannabis. Anyone who wanted to use it could do so. We see similar polarisations of views about medical use, and which tend to line up with people's views about what policy should be towards recreational use, with people either denying any medical use or arguing that there's a huge unmet need for medical use, and often the evaluation of the evidence typically tends to be driven by people's pre-existing policy positions. So what I want to, hitting it too hard, is look at these key questions very briefly. Michelle's given us a good overview of how cannabinoids act in the brain, and so I'll very briefly look at whether cannabinoids have medical uses, the extent to which pharmaceutical forms of cannabinoids might provide the solution to issues of medical use, and then the question of whether we should allow cannabis to be smoked for medical purposes, and if so, how, given existing prohibitions on recreational use and pharmaceutical regulatory requirements. So just some key terms. Michelle's already defined some of these, but by cannabis I mean any of the products of the plant, cannabis sativa or the marijuana hash or cannabis extracts. As we'll see, there are medicinal extracts or nabiximols in generic term, or Sativex, the trade name for these. And cannabinoids, which are potentially therapeutic drugs that could be used that have act on cannabinoid receptors. And these could be thought of as comprising cannabis extracts, such as Sativex, the drugs derived from the cannabis plant of the sort that Michelle's just outlined, or synthetic drugs that also act on cannabinoid receptors. As she pointed out, they could either be agonists, that is, they could act on receptors in ways that mimic the effects of THC and the endogenous cannabinoids, or they could be antagonists, and that is, drugs that block or block the effects of cannabinoid receptors. And the pharmaceutical industry has shown much more interest in the latter than the former, and they don't raise the sorts of issues we're talking about because typically they don't have psychoactive effects. What are the major medical uses of cannabinoids? Well, I think the first point to make is they're all symptomatic relief is the primary aim, so they're usually intended as adjunctive or second-line treatments in combination with other treatments for underlying conditions. And the major uses for which it's been advocated over the last 30, 40 years has been in controlling nausea and vomiting, in cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy or radiotherapy, stimulating appetite, particularly in cancer patients and patients with AIDS, and more recently in reducing muscle spasticity and neuropathic pain in patients with multiple sclerosis. And I've put asterisks against those because, as we'll see, in each of those cases there's reasonable, although not overwhelming evidence, supportive of therapeutic efficacy for synthetic THC and other cannabinoids. There's also reasonably suggestive evidence of potential therapeutic use in glaucoma, although that's not really been pursued. And there's interest in the cannabinoids in the treatment of chronic pain. And as we'll see, that indication is a major motive for the medical use of cannabis in some countries. Very briefly go over the evidence for nausea and vomiting. Most of this is pretty old now. There were trials done in the 70s and 80s demonstrating that THC had antiemetic effects. Typically, these trials compared THC, synthetic THC, delivered typically in the form of Marinol, as having more antiemetic effects than the drug that was then used to treat nausea and vomiting in cancer, and that was prochlorperazine. But I think it's worth making the point that the effects, even so, were fairly modest, that typically only about a third of patients treated with THC had complete control of their nausea and vomiting, The remainder got some benefit, but less than complete. But since that time, there's newer drugs have been developed for controlling nausea and vomiting, and these produce complete control in up to 90% of cases. So the need for the use of THC for this particular indication has largely disappeared, although there may well still be a role, a more minor one, as a second-line treatment for those minority of patients who fail to respond to the newer drugs. A small number of trials were done at the time of smoking cannabis, and there was some suggestion that it was efficacious, and the only reason for using it in these trials was patients who were vomiting so much they were unable to take drugs orally, but very limited evidence for smoked cannabis. If we look at wasting syndrome and anorexia in age-related wasting, this indication, as we'll see, was approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the US on the basis of what subsequent Cochrane reviews have concluded was very weak evidence, a small number of trials. And again, its main role was as an adjunctive treatment. This particular use has largely disappeared for other reasons. Most people with HIV infections these days don't develop AIDS because they're treated with highly effective antiretroviral drugs, and so don't progress to this particular indication. So the two earliest indications for which the best evidence is around are ones that really don't generate a lot of clinical interest anymore. The area of contemporary greatest interest is in the treatment of neurological disorders, particularly patients with multiple sclerosis who develop muscle spasticity, spasms and painful muscle contractions, and associated with neuropathic pain, that is pain arising from pathological changes in the nervous system. And in the UK, Sativex has been developed and trialled in this particular indication. And this is a medicinal extract from cloned cannabis plants where two plants are combined, or two clones are combined, one with high THC and the other with high CBD or cannabidiol. They're combined so that you get roughly equal quantities of those two cannabinoids, and it's delivered under the tongue in the form of an oral mucosal spray. And this product has in fact been approved in the UK, Canada and a number of other European countries by the pharmaceutical regulatory authorities. And it delivers a controlled and defined dose of these two cannabinoids, and obviously it's preferable as a pharmaceutical because it avoids smoking as a route of administration. And from the point of view of the people doing this work, the method of production of this product is patentable, even if the underlying CBD and THC are not. There's been a series of trials funded by GW Pharmaceuticals, which are the company that developed this product. Reasonably small trials showing an average benefit compared to placebo, a reduction in pain in patients with multiple sclerosis. There's some debate about how significant that difference is. Normally, the particular scale used, people talk about clinical significance as being at least a 2-point reduction. So it's getting towards clinical significance. The more interesting thing about this product is that it was primarily intended to increase motor movement and reduce spasticity. Patients report subjective benefit, but there's no evident objective evidence of improvement in motor symptoms in these patients. So it has been approved for that particular use, and given that the drug's available, there's the potential for off-label use for other indications. What are the risks of using cannabinoids? Well, if we think about acute risk, that is using it for short-term purposes, e.g. as an antiemetic, there are surprisingly few, and the Institute of Medicine review that was done in the late 90s of medicinal cannabis concluded that any adverse side effects from short-term use of cannabinoids were limited, and certainly well within the limits tolerated for many medications that are currently in use. And the major issue was psychomotor impairment, so patients would be advised not to drive after using these particular cannabinoids. Reasonably low rates of adverse events in the clinical trials, with the most common being dizziness and some other unwanted psychoactive effects. But typically patients don't report the symptoms of a high that you'd get, say, with smoking cannabis for recreational reasons. The big unknown, of course, was what are the risks of chronic use, particularly if we're talking about, say, patients with multiple sclerosis who might be using these products daily over periods of years. Well, the question here is unanswered. We know, as we've heard over the last couple of days, quite a bit about the adverse effects of recreational use by young adults, but that's primarily smoking and probably ingesting much larger doses of THC than would be the case for medicinal use. So it's uncertain how relevant our knowledge of adverse effects in recreational users is to middle-aged and older adults who might be using these drugs for medicinal purposes. The major health risks of possible relevance, dependence. I think it's quite possible that people who were using it daily could develop tolerance and potentially dependence. That might be regarded as or accepted as an acceptable price to pay for symptom relief in patients with unpleasant and serious chronic illnesses. The risk of myocardial infarction is not really an issue if people are using the drugs orally. It would be a risk if people were smoking cannabis for the reasons I talked about earlier this week. And the same would be the case if chronic bronchitis and respiratory malignancy would not be a concern for drugs or medicinal cannabinoids, but it might be if people were smoking cannabis. Are pharmaceutical cannabinoids the answer? Well, historically they haven't proven to be. The US government, the Food and Drug Administration and the NIH invested money in getting a synthetic THC or dronabinol, trade name Marinol, approved in the mid-80s. And they had to subsidise it because it wasn't a patentable drug, so drug companies weren't interested in it as a blockbuster drug. So it was registered as an orphan drug, but it didn't really have a great deal of uptake. The major reason appeared to be that the oral route of administration wasn't one that most patients liked. It was difficult to titrate the dose, and patients reported high rates of adverse psychoactive effects. Sativex, which is the current product that's sort of been approved, it remains to be seen, I guess, whether it proves to be more acceptable to patients for medical use than dronabinol proved to be in the case in the past. Oops. Should we allow people to smoke cannabis for medical purposes? And this is sort of the big crunch issue that divides people in this area. Why might we want to do that? Well, it might, if Sativex doesn't prove to be any more popular with patients than dronabinol, we may see an increased interest in doing that. If we think it's worth doing, how do we do it? And that's where the challenges arise that I'll briefly talk about now. The minimalist response would be to criminalise medical use for specific medical indications. That is, allow patients a defence against conviction that they're using a drug for medical purposes, which the onus would be on them to demonstrate. And there's a number of US states who've adopted that particular approach. It was recently proposed in New South Wales, an inquiry into medical cannabis, but governments typically tend not to be very enthusiastic about that approach because of challenges around enforcement for police and discriminating bona fide from bogus medical cannabis users. And it's often said to be an unsatisfactory approach to allow patients to use cannabis but sort of leave them at the mercy of the black market to purchase it. If we create special access schemes, as we'll see has been done in Canada, I think there are other equity issues raised by doing that. The US approach, of course, has been citizen-initiated referenda to allow medical marijuana, beginning with California in 1996. I think the number there needs to be updated. There's more states that have passed referenda since, and a number of other states have legislated to allow medical use of marijuana. The states that have had the most liberal forms of medical marijuana initiatives have been California and Colorado and a number of other states. And in these places, any patient who can persuade a doctor to write a recommendation that they might benefit from using cannabis is able to access and buy cannabis from compassion clubs or dispensaries, which are tolerated by the authorities and often licensed. The problems with these schemes are the looseness of the criteria, as many critics argue that what we've got in California is de facto legalisation of cannabis with a fig leaf of medical in front of it to justify it. This has created all sorts of conflict between federal and state laws in the US and created uncertainty for patients and prescribers in how to deal with these issues. I'll just say something briefly about who uses medical marijuana in California, and what you see here is this is some work done 2007 looking at the characteristics of over 4,000 medical marijuana patients in the San Francisco Bay Area. And they don't look like your typical medical marijuana patient. They're 32-year-old males who've been smoking cannabis since the age of 19 or earlier. They smoke daily, an eighth of an ounce to a quarter of an ounce, a week, that is. And given we don't have data on the indications for which they're using cannabis, but it's pretty unlikely that they've got AIDS, cancer or serious neurological diseases. We know from one study that was done in the San Francisco Bay Area that a fair number of these patients in inverted commas, report that they're using cannabis as an alternative to alcohol and other drugs from which they were dependent. So in lots of ways, arguably, at least in parts of California, the medical marijuana scheme is a de facto marijuana maintenance program. There might be arguments to be made for that as a way of containing and regulating the market, but it doesn't look like a medical cannabis program. If we look at the Canadian system, and this system has largely been one that's been forced on the Canadian government by decisions made in their High Court, which has compelled the government to provide access to cannabis for patients who may benefit from its use. And in 1999, they legislated to allow patients who were approved by Health Canada to possess and grow cannabis for their own use. And if they were unable to do so, they could nominate a carer who'd do that for them. The Canadian program has been I think probably, I would guess, a nightmare for the poor people who've had to administer it, because on the whole, doctors are reluctant to prescribe for the good reason that their health insurance, their medical liability insurers sort of tell them that they're on their own. If any patients have adverse consequences, then they can be sued, and they won't be covered by their liability insurers. The patients who've had access to the scheme complain about the quality of the cannabis and the cost, and there are real issues, I think, around equity, that you've got government spending large amounts of money and providing an unapproved drug of uncertain safety and efficacy to patients when there's large numbers of other drugs of known efficacy that governments choose not to subsidise. And I think that's a concern that I'd certainly have with this particular approach. I think the experience in the Netherlands is very instructive, as I'll briefly show. Because the Netherlands, as we well know, have de facto decriminalised and legalised small-scale retail sales of cannabis. They have also allowed the legal supply of medical cannabis via pharmacists on prescription. The form of cannabis they provide is one that's not intended to be smoked, it's intended to be used in the form of a tea or some sort of oral extract. So it's interesting to ask the question, what sort of demand is there for medically prescribed cannabis in a system where if people want to get cannabis, they can purchase it in coffee shops? How much interest is there in it? Well, very recently, there's a couple of Dutch researchers who've monitored the Dutch program, reported on the characteristics of 5,500 medical cannabis patients in the Netherlands over the period 2003 to 2010. And what they've reported is the incidence, meaning new cases of patients presenting for scripts. There's quite a bit of interest initially for the first couple of years of the scheme. About 6 per 100,000 patients were interested. That steadied off to about 2 per 100,000 for the remainder. And the prevalence, meaning the number of people per 100,000 using cannabis for medical purposes in the past year, was somewhere between 5 and 8, which compares to the sort of 100 per 100,000 that's reported in states like California, which suggests that if we take the sort of issue of legality of cannabis away, there's not a huge amount of interest from patients in this, and it's primarily As you can see, they didn't have data on the indications for which the medical cannabis was prescribed, but they could make plausible guesses by looking at other medications that patients were co-prescribed at the same time. And primarily these were pain medications. So use in cancer and HIV was very, very low. So I'll just sum up what I've described as medical cannabis conundrums. These are the sorts of difficult issues that we need to address. The first is that while ever it remains illegal, it can only be prescribed, and it can only be prescribed if it's approved by the pharmaceutical regulatory system and if a company is prepared to supply it. And that's not going to happen for smoked cannabis, for good reasons. And of course we have to ask the question, if we've got a sort of campaign for smoking cannabis for medicinal purposes, why don't we have a similar campaign for bringing back opium smoking? And we don't. We've got pharmaceutical opioids that are widely available. So governments have largely either attempted to get medicinal cannabinoids registered, as happened with Sativex in the UK and Europe, or they've created these special access schemes in the US, which have effectively ignored standard regulatory requirements for pharmaceuticals or subsidised supply, as has been the case in Canada. And I think this is not a desirable way to be making public policy about pharmaceutical drugs. Special case, special treatment, and I think it raises worrying equity issues. The challenge, of course, is there are major disincentives for pharmaceutical companies to develop new cannabinoids. These revolve around the fact that the major active ingredient for a lot of these therapeutic effects appears to be THC, and there's challenges in patenting THC. And there's also the regulatory burdens, given that any drug that has similar effects to THC is going to be very tightly regulated as a controlled substance, and they're potent disincentives for drug companies to get involved. But if that wasn't enough, the other major challenge is that most of the indications for these drugs are fairly small. They're likely to be small markets. And the prior experience with dronabinol just didn't make any money. It wasn't profitable, wasn't popular. So drug companies are going to think twice about getting involved in a drug where there's not much of a market. The drugs that have been developed haven't had much uptake, and if they do develop an effective drug, they're going to be burdened with all sorts of regulations. So the best hope at the moment is with Sativex, and I guess it remains to be seen whether it proves to be more acceptable to patients who are interested in using cannabis than dronabinol has proven to be in the past. If we do go down the route of legally allowing it, as has happened in the US and Canada and some other countries, it's clear that the advantage for medical users is they needn't fear prosecution, but they still often struggle to find doctors who'll prescribe. And legal supply remains a problem unless governments allow cultivation, which is contrary to international drug control treaties, or they supply it, which is in compliance with international drug control treaties. The latter route, which has been pursued in Canada and the Netherlands, and I think is being pursued in Israel, raises, I think, serious equity issues in providing an unapproved drug at considerable expense to very small numbers of patients. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Do we have questions then?
With regards to the risk of smoking cannabis for medical use, have there been any studies published about the use of vaporizers to compare the risk of that with the risk of untoward side effects like potentially cancer and COPD and all that with smoked cannabis?
Not in the medical context. There's been some epidemiological studies suggesting that people who use vaporizers report a lot fewer respiratory symptoms than people who smoke joints or bongs. Good reason to believe that you could reduce the respiratory risks by going with vaporizers, or, as has been happening with the new e-cigarettes, putting sort of cannabis in oil form into those devices and delivering it in that sort of way. So potentially the issue of smoking could be, the risks of smoking could be reduced in those ways, but we haven't got the research at the moment. It's plausible that it might.
Question?
Was there a possibility in the Netherlands research that the low uptake for medical cannabis was confounded by people having other supplies of cannabis rather easily?
Well, that's exactly the point, that if people want to use it for medical purposes, they can. But the number of people who are prepared to go to a doctor and get medical advice in a setting where it's legally available is minuscule.
But I suppose my point is that doesn't necessarily answer the question of how many people are benefiting from the use of cannabis for medical conditions in the Netherlands, if you see what I mean.
Well, if you sort of take the Dennis Peroni view, all cannabis use is medicinal. Everyone who uses it benefits. But I mean, I think people may well benefit from it, but treating it as medical, I think, is a bit of a joke. I mean, I think we need to resolve the bigger debate about whether people should be able to use cannabis for recreational purposes, and the medicinal cannabis will just drop out as an issue, is my prediction. I think that's the point I was making with the Netherlands experience.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the smoking thing. I think it's a bit of a shibboleth, really. This is pretty evident that, vaporisers and so on would be able to reduce the consumption of the combustible material. There's also tinctures and so on as well. Mm-hmm. So I think there are other options, and we're hung up on this business of smoking, but there are other means by which we can do that.
Yep.
Just a comment about the studies and the lack of efficacy many of them show. I think one weakness of many clinical studies is that they look at one specific compound and one specific effect of the compound and don't really look at the overall bigger picture, what else it does in humans, which is of course extremely hard to do in a clinical study, and most of them wouldn't be it would be near impossible to do it like a properly randomized double-blinded trial to give it the clinical oomph or the statistical oomph, so to speak.
Well, I mean, that's how we evaluate drugs, as to whether they do better than placebo. And, it doesn't. I mean, the results, having sat on pharmaceutical regulatory bodies and made decisions about which drugs would be publicly subsidised, I'm pretty underwhelmed by the evidence for Sativex. But, it's been approved, and it probably is better than placebo. If people want to use it, they should be able to. I wouldn't be publicly subsidising it. I don't think it'd get up here in Pharmac either.
Yeah, that means that Sativex probably is not going to be used by people who need it because it's so prohibitively expensive.
Yep, that's one of the downsides, but there's a whole lot of other prohibitively expensive drugs that people can't access either. They've got much better evidence for efficacy. That's the point about equity.
Back to Netherlands, as there are the coffee shops, I'm sure there are grey amounts of people who are using it as medical use when they go to the coffee shops. Do you have some numbers of that, or is that not known?
Well, it's not known, but the point is that people can't be bothered going to doctors if they're using it for medicinal purposes. And my point is that this is a phony debate. If we solve the problem about what we do with cannabis, then people want to smoke it, they can. But don't sort of pretend that there's strong evidence for medical efficacy, because there isn't.
I think it has to be fair, because if it is benefiting people medical-wise, the grey amount of this coffee shops has to be mentioned in public.
Sorry, I didn't get the last bit.
The grey amounts or the dark amount of the people who are going in coffee shops to use it just for medical use, maybe.
Well, there's survey evidence from Canada on the proportion of people who report medicinal use of cannabis in the population. And it's a tiny fraction, and most of them are recreational users. So, I mean, they may use it for medical purposes to feel a bit better on a bad day, but, it's not a potent sort of medicinal, and it blends into. Some people use whiskey for medicinal purposes. Yes, yeah.
Right, if we can thank
Sure.
you very much, Professor Hall.